Your body remembers something your mind has long forgotten. Not a memory you can name or describe. Not something you read in a book or learned in school. Something older than language itself. A memory written not in words but in the way your stomach tightens when you smell smoke and roasting meat. In the way your hand instinctively reaches toward ripe fruit. In the way your eyes still scan open ground. Still search the horizon, the way your ancestors searched it 2 million years ago for the circling of vultures that meant something had died, and there might be food. You are not simply a modern person living in a modern world. You are an ancient creature wearing modern clothing. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, the ancient creature in you already knows things the modern world has made you forget. Things about fire. Things about stone. Things about the long, patient art of staying alive in a world that was never designed to be easy. If you look deeper into what your body is, past the skin and the clothing and the comfortable bed beneath you, you find something that was shaped in a world of grasslands and rivers and night skies so clear and so close that the stars felt like a second fire burning overhead. A world where every meal was a kind of miracle, where hunger was not an inconvenience but a constant companion, a familiar pressure that sharpened the mind and moved the legs and made the difference between finding food and not finding it. That world built you. Every cell you possess carries the echo of it. And tonight, in the quiet, you can almost hear it. Welcome. Settle wherever you are. Let the night hold you. And let this story take you somewhere very far back and very deep down, into the oldest kitchen in human history, and into a question that has never fully stopped being asked. What did we eat before we forgot how to eat? Where are you listening from tonight? Whatever landscape is outside your window right now, whether it is city lights or open fields or the dark shapes of mountains, it was once something different, something wilder, something that fed people in ways we are only beginning to remember. There is a place in Ethiopia called decode, a dry, ancient riverbed where the bones of animals and early humans lie preserved in stone. And in those bones, in cuts made by stone tools nearly 3.5 million years ago, you can read the first sentence of a story that ends with you, lying where you are, breathing slowly, reading the last pages. Those cuts were made by something that was not quite human yet, something smaller and stranger than us, with arms too long for its body and eyes that saw a world we can barely imagine. It stood on 2 legs on the open African savanna and looked at the bones of a large animal that some predator had already killed and abandoned. It had no claws, no sharp teeth, nothing that should have allowed it access to the meat locked inside those bones. But it had something else. It had curiosity. And it had a rock. And in that moment, when something not yet fully human picked up a stone and struck it against bone to hear what was inside, something changed that has never stopped changing. The marrow inside that bone was not just food. It was, in ways no one could have understood at the time, the future. Bone marrow is one of the most concentrated sources of nutrition in nature, rich fat and dense protein, locked inside the hardest part of an animal, protected by structure so thick that even lions and leopards left it behind. The great predators of the African savanna had not evolved to extract it efficiently. They took what they could from the outside and walked away, leaving thousands of calories untouched, scattered across the grassland like a gift no one had thought to open. But a curious creature with a rock could open it. And so began the relationship between humanity and meat, not with a dramatic hunt or a heroic kill, but with patience and a stone, and the willingness to arrive after everyone else had already left and to take what remained. This matters because it shaped everything that followed. The decision to eat differently, to look at the world and see food where others saw only bone and waste, was the first great leap of the human mind. Not a leap of strength or speed or aggression, a leap of imagination, a leap of curiosity, a leap that over hundreds of thousands of years would grow into language and fire and the first cities and the stories we are still telling today. But what if the story is older than we know? What if the memory of how we once ate is not just written in our bones and our digestive systems and our cravings for fat and salt and sweetness? What if it is also written in the oldest stories human beings have ever told? In the texts pressed into clay tablets by hands that knew nothing of what we now call science, but that knew something else entirely. Something we have been trying to recover for a long time. The Sumerians, who built the first cities in the river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, left behind thousands of clay tablets inscribed with their knowledge, their stories, their laws, and their understanding of where they came from. Among the oldest of those texts, there are references to a time before the flood, a time when the Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens, walked among people and taught them the arts of civilization, agriculture, writing, the measurement of time, the understanding of the sky. The Sumerian word for these gifts was me, usually translated as divine laws or the principles of civilization. But read differently, the me was something like a curriculum, a set of knowledge delivered to humanity from somewhere else, from someone who already knew. The truth may be that the Sumerians were remembering something real, something compressed through thousands of years of oral tradition into the language of gods and gifts and divine instruction. But behind that language, a simpler story. Someone knew how to grow grain. Someone understood the movements of the stars. Someone could teach these things because they had already learned them in a world that no longer existed, a world that the flood had taken. Let the thought settle gently, the way things settle in still water before the surface goes completely smooth. Because the flood in the Sumerian texts was not metaphor, it was memory. Memory of a real event. The same event written in ice cores drilled from the center of Greenland. The same event preserved in the pollen records of ancient lake sediments. The same event told in dozens of different languages by dozens of different peoples on every inhabited continent on Earth. The Great Flood. The ending of a world. The beginning of another. And in the aftermath, people carrying what they could, knowledge wrapped in story, pressed into clay, aligned in stone, preserved in the only forms that could survive 10,000 years of rain and wind and forgetting. But we are getting ahead of the story, or perhaps behind it. Time moves strangely in the oldest parts of human history. Let us go back to the fire. Somewhere around 1 million years ago, in a cave in what is now South Africa, someone built a fire. Not a fire started by lightning and cautiously maintained. A controlled fire, built deliberately, fed carefully, kept alive day after day in a protected place. The evidence is there in the cave sediments, in layers of ash and charred bone and heated stone, that tell the same story over thousands of years of occupation. Someone was here. Someone made fire. Someone cooked. The cooking hypothesis, developed by researchers who have spent their careers asking what made us human, argues that fire did more for human evolution than almost any other discovery in our history. And when you understand what cooking actually does, the argument becomes difficult to resist. Your body spends an enormous amount of its energy on digestion. Raw food is hard to break down. Tough plant cell walls resist your enzymes. Proteins lock themselves in configurations that are difficult to unfold. Starches sit in forms that pass through you largely undigested. Your gut has to be large and metabolically expensive just to handle the workload. Fire changes all of this. Heat breaks down the structures that protect nutrients in raw food. Collagen in meat dissolves into something tender. Plant cell walls rupture, releasing what was inside. Starches transform from bitter, rock-hard resistance into soft sweetness. The fire does the work before the food enters your mouth, and your body receives the calories without having to spend so many to extract them. The energy that is freed up goes somewhere. It goes into the brain. Brain tissue is the most metabolically expensive tissue in your body. It burns 20% of your total energy budget, despite being only 2% of your weight. For most species, growing a larger brain is impossible, simply because there is not enough surplus energy available. But with cooking, suddenly the surplus exists. The freed up calories can be redirected from the enormous metabolic cost of digesting raw food into the growth and maintenance of more complex neural tissue. And over hundreds of thousands of years, that is exactly what happened. The bodies in the fossil record show it clearly. As controlled fire use develops, teeth get smaller, jaws become less massive. The enormous chewing muscles that required heavy skull bones to anchor them begin to reduce. And as those heavy structures disappear, skulls become lighter, more rounded, and the brain case inside begins to expand. The signature of cooking written in bone. But the fire did more than reshape bodies. It reshaped time. Before fire, darkness meant danger. When the sun went down, human beings did what prey animals do. They found a safe place and went still. The darkness belonged to things with better night vision, better claws, better teeth. Fire changed the night. It pushed the darkness back. It held the predators at a distance. It created a protected space that belonged to the people who tended it. And in that space, for the first time, human beings had hours they had never had before. Hours after the end of useful daylight and before sleep. Hours that had to be filled with something. They were filled with talking, and with teaching, and with telling stories, and with the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge that one generation passed to the next around the warmth and the light of a fire that someone had built and someone had to keep alive. This is where language deepens. This is where the transmission of knowledge becomes something systematic and reliable. Not just imitation of behavior, but the communication of ideas. The explanation of why. The narration of experience. The description of things that are not present. Things that happened in the past. Things that might happen in the future. The hearth was the first classroom, the first theatre, the first library. And what was cooked there, what the fire transformed from raw material into nourishment, was the full breadth of what the landscape offered. Not just meat, though meat was prized above almost everything else, for reasons your body still understands. Consider what happened when a large animal was taken. The hunters returned with more calories than a small group could eat in a day or two. News spread along whatever paths of communication existed when neighboring groups arrived. There was work first. Skinning, cutting. The careful distribution of different parts to different people. Then as the fire grew and the first pieces of meat began to crisp over the coals, as the smell drifted through the night air, something else began to happen. People talked. They told stories of past hunts. They made agreements. They sang, perhaps, or drummed, or simply sat in the orange light and felt for a few hours that the world was generous and they were safe inside it. Fat was the prize they were all seeking, not lean muscle, though that had value too. The organs, the marrow, the kidney fat, the deposits around the brain. These parts contained more than twice the calories per gram of pure protein, in a world where starvation was always possible. Fat was survival stored in the most concentrated form nature had found. And your body still knows this. That deep pull toward rich, fatty food is not a failure of willpower. It is the memory of a world where richness was rare and the body was right to want as much of it as possible whenever it appeared. But what if the story of that rich world, the world before the flood, was not as simple as we imagine? The Anunnaki texts describe a period before human civilization, when beings of great knowledge lived among people and taught them. The word Anunnaki translates, depending on the reading, as those who came from the sky to earth, or those of royal blood who descended from the heavens. They appear in the Sumerian tablets not as vague supernatural forces, but as specific beings with names and personalities and areas of expertise. Enki, the Lord of wisdom and deep waters, keeper of the me, the civilizational technologies. Enlil, who commanded winds and earth. Anu, who ruled the heavens. Inanna, the great queen of the sky, who travels to Enki to acquire the me and bring their gifts to her city. These texts read, in places, less like mythology and more like administrative records. The Anunnaki argue with each other. They make decisions and regret them. They have subordinates and responsibilities. A civilization this bureaucratically detailed does not usually arise from pure imagination. But what if the direction of our interpretation has been reversed? What if the Anunnaki were not invented to explain natural forces? What if they were real? In whatever compressed and mythologized form, memory can preserve across 10,000 years of oral tradition. What if the knowledge the Sumerians described as divine gift was something else? Something simpler and stranger. The preserved knowledge of people who had learned over generations how to grow grain, how to read the sky, how to build things that lasted. People who had been living in a world now underwater, a world that rose and covered them when the ice melted and the sea came in. Deep beneath the Persian Gulf, researchers have found evidence of a freshwater lake that existed during the last ice age when sea levels were much lower than today. The rivers, now called the Tigris and Euphrates, flowed into this basin. The region would have been, by the standards of the late Ice Age, extraordinarily fertile. Well-watered, warm, sheltered. Some researchers have proposed that this submerged landscape was inhabited for thousands of years before the seas rose and covered it. People living in it would have had generations to develop knowledge of agriculture, of astronomy, of the construction of permanent settlements. When the water came, they moved north into the river valleys, carrying everything they could not leave behind, carrying the me. This is not a claim about gods. It is a claim about people. People who knew things that other people did not, and who, when the world they lived in was taken by the sea, brought that knowledge with them and gave it, over time, to others who were still learning. The flood was not the end of the story. It was the moment of transmission, the moment the knowledge jumped from one world to another, and the stories the survivors told about the people who had taught them, about the advanced beings who arrived with gifts of civilization, were not invention. They were memory, already beginning its long transformation through generation after generation of telling. Let your breathing slow now. Let the image of the ancient world settle around you, like smoke from a fire that has been burning for a very long time. The stars above you tonight are the same stars your ancestors watched. They do not know you are here. They burn without concern for the small warm creatures on the surface of the third planet who have been looking up at them for millions of years, using them as a calendar, a map, a language, using them to know when to plant and when to move and when the floods would come again. The Sumerians watched those stars with extraordinary care. Their astronomical knowledge was sophisticated enough to track the movements of planets, to predict eclipses, to calculate the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of roughly 25,000 years in the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. This knowledge did not appear from nowhere. It was accumulated over generations, probably over many generations before the ones who finally pressed it into clay. As if it had been inherited, as if it had come from somewhere already advanced. The Sumerian king lists names rulers from before the flood, whose reigns lasted for tens of thousands of years. Scholars dismiss these numbers as mythological exaggeration. But what if they are measuring something different? What if the units are not solar years at all, but astronomical cycles, and periods of time that made sense to a civilization that understood the sky as a clock, not a decoration? The truth may be something we cannot fully recover. Too much has been buried, flooded, eroded, and forgotten. But the shape of the story remains. A world before. Knowledge of that world preserved and passed down. A disaster that changed everything. And in the aftermath, a long, patient rebuilding. We are still in that rebuilding. We have always been in that rebuilding. And part of what is being rebuilt, slowly and imperfectly, is the understanding of our own bodies, of what we are and what we need, and what the long history of our relationship with food has made us. Because the human body is not designed for the modern world. It is designed for something older, something that the modern world has covered over so completely that we have almost stopped being able to see it beneath the surface. Your digestive system expects things that most people no longer eat. The particular fibers that come from roots dug from hard soil, the diverse plant matter that represents not 1 or 2 or 10 species, but dozens, changing with the seasons, offering different nutrients in different proportions throughout the year. The slow-burning fats that come from animals that have spent their lives moving through landscapes and eating what landscapes naturally provide. Your gut bacteria, the invisible civilization that lives inside you, and that is as essential to your function as your organs and your bones, evolved in a world of extraordinary microbial diversity. Every handful of wild tuber, every piece of meat taken from a freshly killed animal, every fermented food that formed naturally in a clay pit or a skin bag or the hollow of a tree was seeded with microbes. Microbes that trained your immune system, that broke down food your own enzymes could not handle, that produced molecules your brain and body needed. Modern research is beginning to find what the loss of this diversity has cost us. Inflammatory conditions, autoimmune disorders, the quiet, persistent mismatch between ancient biology and modern environment that no one can point to directly, but that shows up everywhere you look if you know what to look for. But here is what the ancient record also shows. Human beings were never designed for one diet, not a specific ratio of protein to fat to carbohydrate, not one particular set of foods eaten in one particular way at one particular time of day. They were designed for flexibility, for the ability to eat almost anything, for the remarkable capacity to survive on what is available and to thrive when what is available is good. The Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins, who lived in Ice Age Europe and the Middle East for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing, were master hunters. Their bone chemistry tells the story clearly. In the cold northern regions, their diet was dominated by large mammals: mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer. The isotope signatures in their bones sit at the very top of the food web, alongside apex predators, sometimes above them. They were not scavenging the edges. They were the predators. But move south, toward the Mediterranean, and the picture changes. In warmer, more forested landscapes, the Neanderthal diet broadens. Pine nuts, acorns soaked and roasted to remove their bitterness, shellfish, tubers, even plants with no caloric value but known medicinal properties, anti-inflammatory herbs, found preserved in the ancient dental calculus of individuals whose bones showed signs of injury and infection. They were not just eating. They were managing their bodies with what the landscape offered, using food as medicine in ways that would not surprise anyone who had grown up knowing the plants of a particular region. And they cooked. Not simply roasting meat over open flames, though that too. Evidence from Neanderthal sites suggests they used a technique called stone boiling, heating rocks in a fire until they were intensely hot, and then dropping them into containers of water skin bags or clay-lined pits, to bring the liquid to a simmer, dropping in meat or roots or seeds, and producing something that was not exactly stew, but was something in that direction, something that required planning and patience, and the accumulated knowledge of how to transform raw material into nourishment. A civilization this capable does not simply vanish without leaving something behind. And perhaps what it left behind was not in stone or clay, but in the bones of the people who came after, in the knowledge that was passed along in whatever forms knowledge could travel before writing existed, in the stories told around fires in the dark. Let me ask you something, in the quiet of wherever you are tonight. When you think about food, what do you feel? Not what do you know, not what you have been told, but what do you feel? Is there something in you that responds differently to a meal eaten slowly around a table with people you trust than to food consumed alone in artificial light? Is there something in you that responds to smoke, to the smell of roasting meat or warming roots, that seems older than any particular memory you can name? That response is not nostalgia. It is not sentiment. It is the living echo of millions of years of the same experience, repeated so many times in so many lives that it has become part of what you are. Let me know in the comments, wherever you are listening from tonight, whether there is a food that feels ancient to you, a flavor or a smell or a texture that seems to reach further back than your own life. You might be surprised by what other people answer. The plants that fed the earliest human populations were not the plants we grow in fields today. They were wild, difficult, full of defensive compounds that plants evolved over millions of years to discourage animals from eating them. Bitter, sometimes toxic, requiring specific preparation to be made safe. But here is what is remarkable. The people who depended on these plants knew them completely, in the way that only generations of accumulated knowledge can produce. They knew which part of a plant was edible at which stage of its growth. They knew which plants were toxic raw and safe when cooked, which required soaking and drying, which could only be eaten in small amounts before they became dangerous. They knew the places where each plant grew, or the time of year when it would be ready, the signs that said, this tuber is good and this one is not. This knowledge was not written down. It could not have been, because writing would not exist for another 10,000 years in most of the world. It lived in the minds and the mouths of the people who carried it, passing from elder to child around fires and in the movement of groups through landscapes that they knew as completely as you know the rooms of your own home. When that knowledge was lost, it was lost completely. Modern experiments with foraging, even by people who have studied wild plants academically, almost always fail. Not because the knowledge is impossible to acquire, but because it takes generations to build and only moments of catastrophe to destroy. This is one of the things the flood myths are preserving. Not just the memory of a disaster, the memory of what was lost in the disaster, the knowledge, the understanding of plants and animals and seasons and sky that had been built over thousands of years and that the waters swept away. And the Anunnaki, whatever they were, in the original memory that the Sumerians were preserving, were the ones who brought it back, or kept it alive through the disaster, or arrived after, with the pieces that could be reassembled into something functional. Agriculture, in the Sumerian telling, was not invented, it was given. Wheat and barley were not discovered by accident. They were gifts of knowledge from beings who already knew. What if that memory is accurate? What if the first farmers were not nomadic hunter-gatherers who gradually noticed that seeds grew near where food had been discarded? What if they were the descendants of people who had already been farming for generations in a place that no longer existed, and who brought their knowledge with them when that place was taken by the sea? The first field would not have looked like a field to someone who did not already know what a field was supposed to look like. It would have looked like a patch of stubborn grass near a seasonal stream, but the person tending it would have known what it was because they had seen it before, in a memory that was not their own, in a story told to them by someone who had seen it in the world before the water came. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe, not in monuments alone, though monuments help, not in writing alone, though writing preserves, but in the deep, persistent memory of the body, in the habits that become instinct, in the practices that become ritual, in the stories that keep the knowledge alive until the world is ready to use it again. Your body is doing this right now, in its cravings and its aversions, in the ways it responds to different foods, in the ancient bacterial community that lives inside you and that remembers, in its own microbial way, the diversity of the world your ancestors ate from. You carry more non-human cells than human ones. The bacteria in your gut outweigh your brain. They have been with your lineage for longer than the genus Homo has existed, adapting alongside you, co-evolving with every shift in diet and environment, becoming as much a part of what you are as your own DNA. And they are, in their quiet, invisible way, ancient. They remember the roots and the wild fruits and the fermented things left in clay pits. They remember the seasonal shifts from meat-heavy winters to plant-rich springs. They remember the diversity of a world that offered hundreds of different species across the course of a year, rather than the handful of crops and processed foods that dominate modern diets. When modern research studies the gut bacteria of the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last groups still living primarily as hunter-gatherers, what they find looks radically different from what they find in industrialized populations. Richer, more diverse, full of species that have disappeared from Western guts entirely, species that appear to have evolved specifically to process the kinds of fibrous wild foods that our ancient ancestors ate. And the Hadza gut bacteria shift with the seasons, contracting and expanding, changing in composition as the diet changes with the landscape through the year, an internal ecosystem breathing with the external one. The way our bodies were designed to function. The loss of that diversity has costs that we are only beginning to measure. Conditions that were rare or unknown in pre-agricultural populations are now among the most common sources of illness in modern societies. The inflammation that should be a temporary response to injury or infection, but that never quite turns off. The immune system that cannot distinguish between genuine threats and harmless proteins. The metabolic machinery that was built for a world of scarcity and that runs quietly wrong in a world of permanent abundance. But these are not failures of the body. They are mismatches. The body is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is simply doing it in a world that has changed faster than evolution can follow. And somewhere in the space between the ancient design and the modern world, in the conversation between what we are and what we have become, there are quieter signals worth listening to. Not instructions, not prescriptions. Simply the murmur of a very long history trying to make itself heard through the noise of the present. The smell of smoke and roasting food is one of those signals. The pull toward fat and sweetness and the complex flavors that come from fermentation is another. The way your body feels different after eating something close to its original form versus something that has been processed into near abstraction. The way you sleep differently, move differently, may think differently depending on what you have given your ancient biology to work with. These are not the insights of nutritional science, though nutritional science is slowly catching up to them. These are the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of survival, coded into your cells, expressed in your gut bacteria, whispering in your cravings and your aversions. You do not need to go back to the grassland to hear them. You do not need to hunt or forage or eat insects or ferment things in clay pots, though all of those things have their own kind of truth in them. You need only to be a little quieter and a little more curious about the ancient creature inside the modern person. the one who still looks up at the stars, the one who still responds to fire, the one who still knows, somewhere beneath consciousness, that a meal eaten slowly with people you trust tastes different from food consumed alone in the blue glow of a screen. The Sumerians believed that the Anunnaki gave humanity the me, the divine laws and technologies, the arts of civilization, agriculture and writing, and the understanding of time. But perhaps the most important gift was simpler than any of those. Perhaps it was the knowledge of how to pay attention, how to watch a plant through a full cycle of seasons and learn what it needs, how to read the sky as a calendar, how to listen to the body as an instrument that tells the truth about what it needs if you have learned how to hear it. That knowledge is still here. It wasn't lost in the flood. It was carried through, in story and practice, and in the deep biological memory of the human body itself. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you are part of that unbroken chain of carrying. You are the current recipient of a transmission that began around a fire in the African savannah 3 million years ago, and that has passed through every generation since, changing form, changing language, changing context, but never quite losing the thread. Your body knows how to sleep. It has been doing this since before your species existed. Your breath knows its own rhythm. Your temperature is already beginning to fall in the ancient preparation for rest. Your brain is already sorting the day's experience, making sense of what it received, sending the keeper things into deeper storage. You do not have to do anything for any of this to happen. Your ancient body already knows. Let the fire burn low. Let the stars wheel slowly overhead in whatever sky exists above wherever you are. Let the question of what we once were and what we are becoming rest for now, unanswered and untroubled, in the dark. The Anunnaki, if they existed, did not teach us to be anxious. Whatever knowledge they transmitted, whatever civilization they helped rebuild after the water receded, it was built on the understanding that the body is wise, that the land is generous, that the sky is a language that can be learned, that fire is a gift and food is a gift, and the night is not an enemy, but a companion that has been here since before there were words for it. You are here because every person before you survived long enough to have children. Every one of them found food in a world that was not always generous. Every one of them slept in the dark and rose in the morning and kept the thread going. The thread has reached you. Tonight, you are the end of a 3 million year story that has not yet decided how it will continue. But that is tomorrow's question. Tonight, the fire is low, and the stars are old, and the world is quiet, and you already know everything your body needs to know to take you safely through to morning. Let it do its ancient work. Sleep well. Before there were words for hunger, there was hunger. Before there were words for fire, there was fire. And before there was any story told in any language about where we came from, and why we eat what we eat, and why our bodies want what they want, the body itself was already keeping records. The archaeological evidence is written in teeth, in bones, in the microscopic contents of fossilized human waste found in caves and shelters across 6 continents, in the hardened plaque on ancient teeth that preserves, in extraordinary detail, the last things that passed through the mouths of people who lived 10,000 years ago and 40,000 years ago and longer. When researchers examine this ancient dental calculus, the build-up that accumulates on teeth over a lifetime, they find something that challenges every simple story we have ever told about how our ancestors ate. They find diversity. Extraordinary, almost overwhelming diversity. Pollen from dozens of different plant species, starch grains from roots and tubers that required specific preparation to be edible, evidence of cooking Evidence of fermentation. New evidence of a relationship with the plant world so intimate and so sophisticated that the term hunter-gatherer, with all its implication of simple opportunism, barely begins to capture it. These were not people stumbling through the landscape, eating whatever was within reach. They were people with libraries in their heads, libraries of botanical knowledge accumulated over generations, updated seasonally, tested and refined by every person who ever learned which plant was safe and which was not, which root was bitter, raw and sweet when roasted, which leaves could be chewed as medicine, and which would kill you. And alongside this botanical knowledge, running like a quiet river beneath all of it, was the knowledge of fermentation. Not the deliberate, as controlled fermentation of cheese and wine and bread that would come later with agriculture. Something older. Something that probably began, as so many things in human history began, as an accident noticed and then remembered. Food left in the dark, in a clay pot, in a pit lined with leaves, in the hollow of a stone. Returning days or weeks later to find something changed, something sour or fizzy or differently flavored in ways that were not spoilage, something that, when eaten, seemed to settle the stomach rather than trouble it. The microbes had been there all along, on the surfaces of everything, in the soil and the water and the air, and on the hands of the people who handled the food. When conditions were right, temperature and moisture and time, they would begin their invisible work, breaking down tough carbohydrates, or producing acids that kept other, more dangerous microbes at bay, changing the chemistry of whatever they inhabited in ways that made it more digestible, more nutritious, more alive. Your ancestors did not understand this mechanistically. They did not know about microbes, but they understood the pattern. They recognized the difference between food that had gone bad and food that had transformed. They learned, over thousands of years of observation, which transformations were safe and which were not, which containers, which temperatures, which durations, which original materials produced good results. This accumulated knowledge of fermentation was not written down any more than the knowledge of plants was written down. It lived in practice, in the specific gestures of preparation passed from one set of hands to another, in the particular containers that were used for particular purposes, in the timing and the placement and the judgment that came from having watched someone else do it correctly 100 times before you tried it yourself. When agriculture came and the first cities rose and writing was invented, some of this knowledge made it into the records. The Sumerians kept meticulous accounts of the production of beer and bread, both products of fermentation, both central to the economy and the ritual life of their civilization. Beer appears in the earliest Sumerian texts as something so fundamental that it is listed among the gifts of civilization. Not a luxury, a staple, a technology as essential as the plough. What if the knowledge of fermentation that the Sumerians inherited had been carried from an older world? What if among the things the Anunnaki transmitted was not just the knowledge of grain cultivation, but the knowledge of what to do with grain once you had it? The specific microbial processes that turn seeds into something that can be stored, transported, traded, and shared. The ancient biotechnology that underlies every fermented food and drink and that makes whole categories of nutrition available that would otherwise be locked away. The truth may be something we cannot verify, but the pattern points in an interesting direction. Every ancient civilization that developed independently developed fermentation. Not all of them developed writing. Not all of them built monuments, but all of them fermented. As if this particular piece of knowledge is so fundamental to human survival and to the health of the human body that it was rediscovered whenever the conditions allowed. Or perhaps not rediscovered. Perhaps carried. Perhaps transmitted across catastrophe in exactly the way the Sumerian texts describe, from those who knew to those who needed to learn. Let the thought sit with you for a moment, the way things sit in the quiet before sleep. not as a claim requiring proof, but as a possibility worth feeling. The world is older than we usually remember. The knowledge encoded in your body, in the preferences of your palate, and the responses of your gut bacteria, and the way your metabolism rises and falls with the rhythm of eating and fasting, is older than any civilization we can name. You are not a modern creature accidentally equipped with an ancient body. You are an ancient creature who has been living for a remarkably short time, or in a modern world. And the ancient creature, the one shaped by fire and bone marrow and seasonal variation and the patient accumulation of botanical knowledge and the invisible cooperation of 10,000 generations of microbes, is still here, still listening, still responding to things the modern world no longer explains. The pull toward warmth and light in the evening, the way the smell of cooking food changes something in the way you feel, the deep, specific pleasure of a meal that contains the full range of flavors, not just sweet or just salty, but something complex and layered that the tongue recognizes as real, in a way that processed food does not quite manage to be. These responses are not romantic. They are not nostalgia. They are the living residue of millions of years of a particular kind of existence. An existence that was difficult and often brutal and frequently hungry, but that was also, in its way, precisely calibrated to the body that lived it. And somewhere in the gap between that existence and this one, something worth recovering sits waiting to be noticed. Not a dietary system, not a set of rules. Something more intimate and less prescribable than that. A quality of attention, a willingness to listen to what the body says about what it needs and what it does not, rather than overriding those signals with the volume of a world that is built, in many ways, to make that listening impossible. The stars that your ancestors watched to know when to plant and when to move are still there. The knowledge written in your cells is still there. The ancient bacterial community in your gut, despite everything the modern world has done to reduce it, still remembers something of the world it evolved in. You cannot go back. The grassland is planted over. The mammoth is gone. The wild plants that your ancestors knew as intimately as the faces of their children have been replaced in most places by the narrowed, domesticated descendants that can be grown in rows and harvested by machines. But you can pay attention. You can be curious about the signals your body sends. You can be a little more deliberate about the diversity of what you eat, the variety that your ancient gut bacteria are still waiting for. You can notice the difference between being full and being nourished, between eating quickly in isolation and eating slowly in the presence of people, the way your ancestors ate around every fire they ever built. These are not prescriptions. They are invitations, small openings toward a conversation that your body has been trying to have with you for your entire life. And tonight, as sleep approaches, as your body begins its ancient preparation for the hours of rest that have been part of your lineage since before you were human, that conversation can rest for a little while too. The ancient creature that you are does not need to understand itself completely. It only needs to be itself, which it is doing perfectly, right now, in this moment. Your breath is slowing. The day is releasing its grip. Whatever you ate today, whatever your body received, it is already doing what it knows how to do with it. Sorting, processing, storing what is useful and releasing what is not. The bacteria in your gut are still working, quietly in the dark. The memories written in your cells are still there. The stars are where they have always been. And somewhere, in the ancient reaches of your lineage, in the long chain of people who ate and slept and woke and kept the thread going, something that might be called gratitude is available if you want to reach for it. Gratitude for the fire that cooked the food, that fed the brain, that told the story, that became, eventually, you. The story is still going. Tonight, it is resting. Sleep well. There is something that happens to the body when it has been given what it actually needs. Not what the modern world tells it to want, but what the deep, ancient design requires. A particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of having eaten enough processed sugar to send the blood into a spike and then a crash. Not the restless, or dissatisfied feeling that comes from having consumed a great volume of something that does not quite satisfy. Something quieter and more complete. The stillness of a body that recognizes, on some cellular level below the reach of thought, that it has been given something real. The Natufian people, who lived in what is now Israel and Jordan and Syria 12,000 years ago, and who were the ancestors of the first farmers, were not the simple nomads that a cursory reading of history might suggest. They built stone foundations for their homes. They buried their dead beneath the floors, with ceremony, with care. They ground wild grain with flat stones, the same grinding motion that leaves its distinctive marks on the bones of wrists and shoulders, the repetitive labor recorded permanently in the skeleton. They were not yet farming. Not quite. But they were watching. They were learning the patterns of wild grain. They were returning to the same productive slopes each year at the same time, harvesting the standing plants with flint-bladed tools, carrying the seeds back to their settlements, storing them in pits lined with stone. They were building a relationship, the slow, patient kind of relationship that unfolds over generations, where neither party is quite aware of how much they are changing each other. The humans were shaping the grain by returning to the same plants year after year, selecting for characteristics that made harvest easier. The grain was shaping the humans by rewarding those who learned its cycles and its needs and its vulnerabilities with the security of a reliable caloric base. And then the climate shifted. The cold period that scientists now call the Younger Dryas arrived approximately 12,800 years ago, and it arrived with a speed that would have been terrifying to experience. Within decades, possibly within years, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped sharply. The rainfall that had supported the dense stands of wild grain in the Levant diminished. The harvests that the Natufians had come to depend on shrank and became unreliable. The people who had been learning the language of wild grain were suddenly asked to speak it fluently in conditions that had changed the grammar entirely. Some groups abandoned their stone foundations and returned to a fully mobile way of life, following whatever food remained. Others did something different. They planted, not out of inspiration or innovation, but out of necessity. If the wild grain was no longer growing where it had grown before, perhaps you could make it grow closer to your water source. Perhaps you could ensure it by giving it the soil preparation and the careful attention and the seasonal protection that it would otherwise have had to achieve on its own. This is not a triumphant story. It is a story of adaptation under pressure. The body that had evolved over millions of years to handle the full seasonal variety of a wild landscape. To eat meat when there was meat, and tubers when there were tubers, and insects, and shellfish, and nuts, and dozens of plant species shifting through the year. That body was about to be asked to run almost entirely on grain. And the record in the bones tells us what happened. You're in skeletons from the first agricultural communities. After the transition from foraging, the markers of health change in ways that are difficult to look at without feeling something. Average height drops, in some cases by several centimeters, in just a few generations. Dental cavities, which were rare in pre-agricultural populations, appear in large numbers. The sticky, high-carbohydrate porridges, made from ground grain, provide exactly the kind of surface that oral bacteria need to proliferate. Abscesses form in jaws that would have been largely clean in the generations before. There are signs in the bones of childhood malnutrition. Horizontal lines in the enamel of teeth where growth paused, briefly, because the body did not have what it needed. Thin areas in the skull around the eyes that suggest chronic anemia from iron-poor diets. The diverse, nutrient-rich food landscape of the forager with its seasonal meat and wild plants and shellfish and insects, had been replaced by a narrower and more monotonous base. More people could be fed from a smaller area. But on average, those people were smaller, sicker, and probably more anxious about the next harvest than their foraging ancestors had been about the next successful hunt. So why did it persist? Why, if the archaeological record is so clear about the health costs of early agriculture, did humanity keep going down that path? Because once you have cleared the wild plants from a valley and planted it with grain, the wild plants do not come back on their own schedule. The landscape you depended on as a forager no longer exists. And because farming populations, even unhealthy ones, grow faster than foraging populations, the children who survive in a farming village, however nutritionally compromised, outnumber the children of mobile foraging bands simply because the caloric density of a stored grain surplus allows for shorter intervals between births. The mathematics of survival, not the wisdom of nutrition, drove the agricultural revolution, but the body never quite forgot what it had been designed for. That is what the gut bacteria preserve. That is what the bone density of pre-agricultural populations compared to their farming descendants shows us. That is what the modern science of human nutrition keeps circling back to from every direction, through every lens it applies. The ancient design was more sophisticated than what replaced it, more diverse, more resilient, more precisely calibrated to keep human beings healthy across the full spectrum of the year. This is not nostalgia for a past that no longer exists. It is information about a present that is still unfolding, about a body that is still trying to be itself inside a world that keeps asking it to be something different. And tonight, that body is lying still in the dark, breathing slowly, doing its ancient work without any instruction from the conscious mind. The bacteria in the gut are processing the day's intake. The immune system is making its quiet calculations. The liver is sorting and transforming and preparing. The brain is consolidating the day's experience into memory. None of this requires your attention. The ancient design does not need to be managed. It only needs to be given, when possible, what it was built for: variety, fiber, real food in forms that retain their complexity, the occasional fast that allows the metabolic machinery to complete its natural cycle, the movement that was never separate from eating in the world the body was built for, the social context of shared meals, the fire, or its modern equivalent, the gathering of people around warmth and food and the exchange of stories. These things are not luxuries. They are, in the most fundamental biological sense, requirements. Requirements so ancient and so deeply encoded that your body continues to signal for them even in a world that has largely forgotten what they are. You are listening, even if you do not always know what you are listening to. The signal is always there. The ancient creature, patient beyond any modern measure of patience, is always sending it. Somewhere in the long quiet of deep history, around a fire that has been burning for millions of years, your ancestors are still eating what the world offered them and being grateful for it, still watching the sky for signs of what comes next, still telling the stories that keep knowledge alive through darkness. You are part of that story. You are the current keeper of that fire. Tonight, the fire is low, and the story is resting, and the stars outside your window are the same ones they watched. You can let go now. The ancient body knows what to do with the night. Let it do its work. Let the old, deep knowledge hold you. Sleep. There is one more thing worth knowing before sleep takes you fully. The knowledge that was preserved. The knowledge that the Sumerians said was given to them. The knowledge that arrived in the river valleys of Mesopotamia with a suddenness that archaeology still struggles to explain. It was not only knowledge of agriculture and astronomy and writing. It was knowledge of the body, of what the body needs, of how to read the signals it sends. The Sumerian medical texts, some of the oldest medical documents ever found, described treatments that use plants in ways that align surprisingly well with what modern pharmacology has since confirmed about those same plants. Anti-inflammatory herbs, digestive aids, compounds that address specific nutrient deficiencies. This knowledge was not guesswork. It was accumulated observation, pressed into clay, preserved for thousands of years, and gradually decoded by modern researchers who find, again and again, that the ancient practitioners knew something. They knew something because someone had taught them, someone who had had time to learn, to observe, to accumulate the kind of evidence that only comes from watching the same treatments applied to the same conditions across enough generations to separate what works from what merely seems to work. In the deep chronology of the Sumerian king list, the beings who taught these things ruled for periods that stretch far beyond the plausible human lifespan. This has always been interpreted as mythology. But what if it is instead a record of institutional continuity? Not individual lifespans, but the continuity of a lineage of knowledge, a school, a tradition, a body of practice maintained and transmitted over thousands of years and eventually compressed, in the telling, into the figure of a single being of extraordinary longevity. What if the Anunnaki were not gods but institutions? Not supernatural beings, but the preserved knowledge of a civilization that had had centuries to develop what it knew, that had survived a catastrophe by the skin of whatever preservation was possible, and that had then spent generations teaching everything it could to the people who came after. The truth may be something we cannot fully reach from where we stand. The evidence is fragmentary, and the interpretation contested. And the honest answer to most questions about the deep past is that we do not know. But we know that the knowledge exists. We know that our bodies carry it. We know that the ancient design, the design shaped in the African savanna, and along coastal shores and around 10,000 generations of cooking fires, is still present in you, still functional, and still waiting for the conditions that allow it to express itself fully. The Anunnaki gave the me, the divine technologies of civilization. But perhaps the most important technology they gave was not agriculture, or writing, or astronomy. Perhaps it was attention, the capacity to observe, to remember, to transmit, to keep knowledge alive across generations and disasters and the long dark intervals between one world and the next. You have that capacity. It is the oldest thing about you. And tonight, in the quiet, you can feel it resting. The long attention, settling into the particular kind of awareness that arises at the edge of sleep. Not the sharp focus of a mind working on a problem. Something softer, more receptive. The state in which things that are normally too quiet to hear become audible. What does your body say when you listen to it in this state? What does it remember that you do not? What ancient knowledge is it still carrying in its chemistry and its bacteria and its deep metabolic rhythms from the world that existed before the world we know? These are not questions that need answering tonight. They are questions worth living with, worth returning to in the ordinary daylight of tomorrow, when the mind is sharp again and the world is asking for your full attention. For now, the questions can rest. The ancient body can rest. The long thread of transmission that runs from the first fire builder to you can rest in this particular link of the chain. This night, in this quiet. The stars are old. The fire is low. The knowledge is safe. Sleep.